Hi everyone, thanks for stopping by Family Essentials for our Family Recipes edition. Today we're making Cajun Jambalaya, which is a recipe that was given to my mom by a neighbor when we lived in Louisiana. The first thing we do when making a recipe is to prepare all of the ingredients ahead of time. First, we're going to chop a small onion. If you're doubling the recipe, use a medium or a large onion. The original recipe calls for a green bell pepper as well, but my family doesn't like it, so we leave it out. Next, you will chop 1 to 2 stalks of celery or 2 to 3 stalks of celery if you're doubling the recipe. You can always keep it at 1 to 2 stalks even if you are doubling if you don't really care for the flavor of celery. And if you really don't like celery, feel free to leave it out. But my family thinks that it gives a great little crunch and we like the flavor of it. Be sure that you chop it in bite-sized pieces, otherwise the larger pieces of celery aren't as pleasant to eat with this recipe. Next will be to prepare 4 cups of beef broth or 8 cups if you're doubling the recipe. You'll see that I'm using better than bouillon. I don't keep cartons of broth on hand, but rather prefer to use this brand of concentrate to make chicken or beef or vegetable broth fresh when I need it. So if you're using this, it will be 4 cups of water to 1.5 tablespoons of concentrate. Next, you will cube or dice 1 ham steak, or 2 ham steaks if you're doubling the recipe. Here you can see that we're using a half ham that we get from Costco because this is more economical for our family and we can slice and freeze the leftovers for another recipe. You will just make your slices and cube or dice the ham to the size that your family prefers. And if your family likes more than 1 ham steak or 2 ham steaks and they really like the ham, feel free to use extra. This recipe is so flexible, you can't mess anything up if you use a little bit more meat or a little bit less meat. It's not chemistry like baking, it's super easy and you can make the modifications that you like to make that works well for your family. Next, you'll slice your kielbasa sausage, or 2 sausage rings if you are doubling the recipe. Our family, once again, actually gets kielbasa from Costco. It's the roasted garlic kielbasa. This comes in a pack of 10, and I usually use 4 to 5 individual sausages for each batch of jambalaya that I make because I do double the recipe. If you use the kielbasa from Costco and you're just making a single batch, then 2 or 3 of the individual sausages will suffice for this recipe. Be sure to slice them thinly enough so they get nice and crispy while cooking. Next, we're going to prepare and set aside our 2 cups of rice, or 4 cups of rice if you're doubling the recipe. It's a good idea to have everything prepared ahead of time so that you can just pour the rice right into the skillet when the time comes. To make jambalaya, start by heating your electric skillet to 300 or 350 degrees Fahrenheit. You will melt 2 tablespoons of butter in the hot skillet, or 4 tablespoons if you're doubling the recipe. One way to make sure that your skillet is hot enough to melt the butter without touching it with your fingers is to flick or splash just a bit of water into it, and if the water bubbles sizzle away, then you know it's ready for the butter. Once the butter is completely melted, we'll begin adding our other ingredients. Our favorite butter to use is grass-fed butter by either Kerrygold or Costco's Kirkland brand grass-fed. Once the butter is melted, add your meat to the skillet and stir to fully coat the meat with the butter. Once the meat is stirred and coated with the butter, it will take approximately 10 to 15 minutes to cook before moving on. Be sure to stir only every few minutes so the meat can get a bit crispy. If you've made extra meat and you need to cook in batches so that the meat can all be touching the skillet and get cooked to a nice little crisp, you can do that as well. For real, don't stir too much. I promise you that getting the sausage and the ham with little crispy edges will be so worth it for this recipe. After 10 to 15 minutes, when the meat is nicely crisped, you'll give one final stir, being sure to scrape the bottom of the skillet, and then you will add your chopped vegetables. Once those are added, stir to mix well with the meat, get some of that butter on them, and let that cook for a few minutes as well, stirring and scraping the bottom of the skillet. After the meat and the vegetables have been stirred and cooked together for a few minutes and the vegetables have begun to soften, you will add 1 to 2 bay leaves and 1 to 2 teaspoons of the seasoning mix. I will include the recipe for the mix in the description below. Be careful though, the seasoning mix is spicy, so it's best to start with less until you know how well you like the spice level in this recipe, and then you can continue to increase as you become familiar with this particular spice load. Once the meat, vegetables, and spices have been cooked together for a few minutes, it's time to add the rice. You'll just pour that rice right over the whole mixture and then carefully stir it all together. If you're not careful, you could have rice pieces flying out of that skillet. But if you stir it together nice and slow, you should be fine. So go ahead and mix the rice in really well with the meat and the vegetables. It'll stick to everything. You're going to cook that for about 5 minutes, being sure to scrape the bottom of the pan as you stir. There's all kinds of good flavor bits down in there. Then you're going to add your beef broth to this. If you are using the 2 cups of rice, it will be 4 cups of beef broth. And if you're using 4 cups of rice because you've doubled the recipe, you will use 8 cups of broth. Just be careful though, because if you have a standard sized skillet, that 8 cups of broth is going to put you right to the top. So you'll just need to be careful as you stir it that you don't overflow. Here you'll see I'm adding an additional 4 cups of water, and that's because when I made my initial 4 cups of broth, I used enough of the concentrate for 8 cups of broth. I have only a 4-cup measuring cup, so I just needed to add the additional amount of water to make 8 cups of broth. Finally, you're going to let that broth come to a boil, put your lid on, and then reduce the heat in the skillet so that it simmers for about 15 to 20 minutes. You will know that it's done when the water is completely absorbed and the rice is tender but still a little bit crunchy. Now your jambalaya is ready to be enjoyed by everyone. This is a wonderful recipe to bring to parties or for having guests over. Enjoy! Please subscribe for more family recipes, cooking tutorials, and recipe walkthroughs. Have an amazing day.